Welcome to GenderED, the podcast where we explore the deeply personal journeys that shape our understanding of gender. I'm your host, Varsha Pillai, and today I'm honored to be joined by a true pioneer in feminist activism, scholarship, and movement building, Srilatha Batliwala. Srilatha is a feminist activist, researcher, and a scholar whose transformative work spans across 4 decades. As a senior advisor for feminist building movements and organizations, she has been instrumental in strengthening women's rights organizations and movements globally. Her groundbreaking research and writing on women's movements, feminist leadership, and women's empowerment have influenced activists, organizations, and policymakers worldwide. Today, we'll explore the personal experience and insights that have shaped Sri Lata's understanding of gender and power and hear about the moments that have defined her remarkable journey as one of the world's most respected feminist thinkers and activists. Srilata, it's an absolute privilege to welcome you to GenderEd.
Thank you so much. Not at all. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope what I have to share is useful to your listeners.
Of course, I know that it will be definitely very, very, powerful and a learning experience for anyone interested in any aspect connected to gender and power. um, your experience has is across different decades of the journeys of feminist activism and scholarship as well. But was there any particular moment in your early life, right, that first brought to your mind, and brought to your attention the gender inequality that pervades our lives?
Yes, indeed, there was. There were, I think, two very profound and unusual experiences. I've now realized that, first of all, uh, crystallized my what I would call my innate feminism, my innate questioning, well, not only of gender differences and discrimination, but of multiple other forms of discrimination and social hierarchy. Um, well, first of all, I must tell you that I had the rare experience of being brought up till the age of 6 by a grandmother who I now understand they are called indigenous feminists. These are women all over the world, in all our families and communities, who just instinctively uh, resisted the kind of very patriarchal power structures in which they had to live and transact their lives. So she decided from a very early age, because I was a very precocious child, always asking why like this, why like that, and so on. So she, from the age of 4 or 5, she used to tell me, "You must study, you must become a lawyer." That was her idea of a good profession for a woman. You must earn your own money. Don't ever be dependent on your husband. You must have a bank account in your own name. This kind of thing. And she encouraged me to question. Instead of saying, keep quiet, don't ask like this, she would say, yes, the child has asked a good question. What do you people have to say? Like this. So that was definitely the root. A second experience was that my aunt, my father's sister, my attama, as we say in Telugu, she became an MP when I was 16.
Wow.
And I went on the campaign trail with her when she was campaigning to contest the election. Yeah. And that was a very profound experience for me because it opened up this whole world of women in these very public spaces and public roles and, aspiring to be political representatives. So that kind of just made me feel, anything is possible. And the sheer confidence and guts that my aunt had, the kinds of, backlash that she faced, etc., was incredible. But what I also saw when she was campaigning was how women responded to her. You know, how grassroots women in her constituency where she was campaigning, how empowered they felt by her seeking to represent them. Anyway, she won, and the rest is history, as they say. So that was the second experience. The third experience, again, very interesting. I mean, I feel very fortunate because these were, unusual and unique experiences. I actually studied English literature in my bachelor's degree. And one of my teachers, one of my lecturers was T.G. Vaidyanathan. And he was an incredible intellectual, and he had this, a huge intellectual curiosity. And when he saw intellectual curiosity in any of his students, he used to form a little, like a group of them. And he used to give us books. They were his personal books, which he used to spend his hard earned money on. And he gave me a series of books by the first sort of Western feminists. So he gave me, for instance, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, Betty Friedan's book, and Kate Millett's, etc. Um, and those, reading those books at the age of, 18, 19, were just revelatory because I suddenly felt that so much suddenly became clear of why things were the way they were. So these were three experiences I thought I would share.
Awesome, because I can see one where it was like your personal journey, where your home front, then there was this one at the education institution, and one I can put it at your the public sphere, right, with your aunt. So it's brilliant, and actually in many ways you're privileged as well because you had these,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
these, these different experiences with these really passionate individuals who really wanted to see you grow, and who were open to you experiencing all of these facets of where power and inequality and discrimination can be seen, can be understood more deeply, right? So thank you so much for sharing, that experience, because I think it sort of also understands your, I mean, it puts a spotlight on your natural and leaning towards academic research and as well, because I can
Yes,
make out because some of this
in
curiosity
fact,
comes
I
from there.
wanted to add that
Yeah.
I think what TGV, our lecturer, Mr. Vaidyanathan, did was
Yeah.
introduce me to the world of theory.
Yeah.
And so, how theory can actually help you understand your reality and how to
Mm.
act in it. And I
Yeah.
think that is something I've carried with me throughout my life. Yeah.
Super. So, now that you've had this understanding of gender power, and it is, I'm sure, evolved through your own personal career as well, right? So, how did that sort of particularly help when you moved between grassroots organizing to the global policy work as well?
Right. So, first of all, I think what was very transformative for me, especially when I first joined the Ford Foundation, was seeing how, because I came from grassroots movement building background, right? And I never expected to get that job as civil society program officer. But what I saw immediately, and I was responsible for both the transnational civil society grants as well as the US nonprofit sector grants. And what I saw immediately was that in the global advocacy spaces, because this was the era, the late 90s, etc., a lot of global activism around, shifting policy on, the Beijing Platform for Action, on, the era of the big UN conferences on, poverty, on environment, on women's issues, etc. So I saw that the issues of the poor, of the deeply marginalized, were being represented, analyzed, and advocated by international NGOs and active advocates and activists who, though they were very passionate, very committed, very sincere, they were nevertheless from a kind of elite, right?
mm,
And I
mm,
saw, because of my own experience, that grassroots movements should, in fact, be speaking for themselves in these spaces. So I introduced an initiative in the Ford Foundation called Grassroots Globalization, where
mm,
I supported grassroots movements to, in their process of linking up across borders, becoming transnational movements themselves, and to represent themselves and speak for themselves in these spaces.
mm, mm,
So that was one, way in which I bridged these two spaces
mm,
and brought my experience from the grassroots into a sort of global arena. The
mm,
second was that being in a space like Ford, I also came to know and interacted with a number of extremely, I think, insightful and amazing feminists who were doing some really path-breaking theory building on power. So, for
mm,
instance, the Just Associates and the founder of Just Associates, Lisa Van Klassen and Valerie Miller, they were working on their first manual on power. And
mm,
they really introduced me to, again, an idea that was kind of nascent, that
mm,
I had sort of, I think, intuitively realized through my own grassroots work, but I hadn't been able to name. The concept of power as not just being direct and visible, but
mm,
invisible and hidden. Invisible power and hidden power. And that enabled me to place, for example, some of the theorization I had done on empowerment in
mm,
identifying, for instance, ideology as a
mm,
very important uh, arena in which we need to make change, not
mm,
just working on the sort of objective day-to-day circumstances of women or on violence or whatever, but on the
mm,
ideologies, the internalized set of ideas and norms which enabled all this to happen, and
mm,
realize that ideology is actually invisible power, you know,
mm. Right,
and
right.
recognizing how hidden power is, how we are compelled to behave in certain ways, not by giving direct orders, but
Mm,
both through fear and deterrence. Oh, if you go out at night at so and so time, this will happen to you. Or if you dress like this, you're inviting sexual assault, or whatever it is. To realize that
mm,
this is a form of hidden power that controls our behavior.
mm,
So that enabled me in turn to, when I moved out of Ford and into the Kennedy School, to really
mm,
look at how we build new theory from practice, to challenge
mm,
a lot of academic theory by advancing the theorization that is rooted in practice. What I was
mm,
also able to do for the first time, working in a sort of global space, is
mm,
to understand and unpack and really research the global history of patriarchy, that this is
mm,
not something that was unique to particular cultures, but was a worldwide power structure, and to study also the universality of women's resistance to patriarchy. And that even to understand my own experience, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, of how feminism was not invented, by Western women theorists or whatever, but that it had been present in societies across the world. So I'll stop there.
Yes, yes. I mean, I would love for you to go ahead and share your, like, how did you, come to that particular point? So go ahead. I think I don't want to stop that because this entire, narrative that you have shared so far is um, it's so powerful. So we would love to, for you to go ahead and, share that as well.
Well, this really goes to the question of how my own cultural background, location, and identity, not just as a Southern feminist, but as a South Asian feminist, as an Indian feminist, influenced my approach to feminism. And that how I was able to bring that unique perspective to the global stage. Um, in my work in the late 80s and 90s, in the women's empowerment program called Mahila Samakhya, I came across for the first time the whole story of Akka Mahadevi, the great poet saint of Karnataka, 12th century poet saint of Karnataka. And when I started studying her vachanas, which are the poems that she wrote, I saw what a powerful feminist perspective she had. So, for example, when Basaveshwara, the great leader of the anti-caste movement of that time in Karnataka and particularly North Karnataka, when he came to her, because by that time she had become an extremely influential figure herself, as both as a spiritual a person, but also, you know, as someone that people looked up to. So he came to her and asked her to support the anti-caste movement. And do you know what one of her conditions were? That she would support the movement that is now we call the Veerashaiva movement only if they included gender, only if they addressed the oppression of women alongside caste oppression.
Yeah,
So, 12th century, my dear, I
yeah.
mean, nobody
Yeah,
in Europe was thinking about things like this at that time.
true, true.
Similarly, bringing things like Sultana's Dream, written by the great Bengali feminist Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain, again written in the late 19th century, the stories of, Savitri Bai Phule, Pandita Ramabhai, women in the Telangana struggle, etc. I was able to bring this entire perspective, which, was a more multifaceted approach to challenging gender discrimination by bringing in issues of caste, bringing in all these issues of norms surrounding, for example, widowhood, women's roles in strong, powerful political movements, etc. So that was how, unpacking the history of patriarchy globally and
Yeah.
studying the universality of feminist resistance also enabled me to bring this unique set of challenges that had arisen in South Asia into
Mm.
that whole space.
Thank you so much for sharing that because I think it brings a lot of perspective to this misunderstanding that we have that feminism is born elsewhere, which is always and already here in all the
Absolutely.
communities globally. I would say, right, not just India, but across all different global communities, wherever women were, in whichever form they were, right? I mean, in their communities, there were some, you can call them mini, I would call them mini feminisms on a day-to-day basis that was happening, stories that we are not privy to right now, but those are already there, right? But thank you so much
Absolutely.
for sharing this, right? Actually would want you to sort of maybe then um, uh, share a little bit about how the gender discourse has been over the last few decades. What were the, those specific moments during this discourse that you found were very, very important, that were very, that were transformative in that sense? But what are those moments also that are concerning?
Um, I think one is this, what I have already mentioned, uh, the power of the concept of intersectionality, that we can never look at gender in isolation, that as an African feminist put it very beautifully, she said, it's not like, okay, on Monday you'll be discriminated because you're female. On Tuesday you'll be discriminated because you're, from this tribe or that caste or whatever. Wednesday because you're doing this work which is considered dirty or polluting. And Thursday because you have a disability. And Friday because you're not heterosexual. It's all happening all together at the same time. So I think intersectionality was profound. I mean, somebody named it, but again, it was one of those things which I had innately understood because of being located and my much of my work being in India and seeing how, caste, religion, and gender, for instance, and poverty work together. So that was, a profound, I think, aha moment. And that was thanks to Black feminists who really brought in the whole issue of race and gender, etc. I think another big leap forward for me was how the sort of the movement began to really look at other gender identities and going beyond just, women as, those assigned at birth as female kind of thing, and recognizing the struggles of people of other gender identities and sexual preferences and so on. What I think was a bit disturbing for me, I'll give you two examples, and one will sound a bit, I don't know, controversial or paradoxical, I don't know. I found the overwhelming focus on a particular individualized form of violence against women very disturbing. Because again, as a South Asian feminist, I had seen that this was part of the systemic way in which power structures controlled women of certain classes and castes. So, if I'm a tribal woman or a tribal young woman, and the feeling that I'm a sort of fair target for sexual violence, that is systemic and structural. It's not about just the violence that happens to that individual woman. Whereas I found largely on the sort of global stage that there was this overwhelming focus on individual acts of violence and not seeing it as structural and systemic, and not seeing it as one of the last resorts of patriarchy of patriarchy and class and race and caste power structures to keep certain communities under control. And for example, I saw how women who had been victims of sexual violence in conflict and war, they were beginning to say that, wait a minute, this is not about sexual violence. This is a method that's being used in conflict to actually oppress the other side and to shame the men of the other side. And, it's very much a part of war. So recognizing it as a war crime, for instance, was a huge leap forward. So I think that was one thing, the overwhelming focus on violence against women as an individualized experience was disturbing. The other thing that was very disturbing to me, because even when I was a student at Tata Institute of Social Science in Bombay, part of my field work was working with underage sex workers who were brought to these rescue homes, as they were called, and learning so much from them, about the circumstances that had led them into sex work, of why, for many of them, sex work was preferable to some of the alternatives. For example, living with a girl from an extremely poor family who was married off to a 55-year-old man and then facing violence from him every night if he was not able to have sex with her for whatever reason. So I found it very disturbing to encounter this whole abolitionist approach that, and I saw how the feminist movement was deeply divided on the issue of sex work. Between those who saw all sex work as innately exploitative and oppressive of women, and didn't see how there were multiple occupations in which women are that are both physically and economically extremely exploitative and oppressive. And those who felt that sex workers are also women, hello, and we should be working to protect their rights, support their struggles, let them define, what they see as their goals for moving forward, and let them decide whether escaping sex work is the one and only goal they want to have. So I think these are a couple of examples of things that I found very disturbing.
Yeah, indeed. And I think oftentimes we get into this sort of frame where would we put rights first? Would we put, circumstances, our own social identities? So I think that is going to continuously, and also it depends on, what lens you're putting at any point of time. To my mind, I think the lens that you need to put is what is in the best interest of that particular person, and then move forward. But that is me, and it could be, I'm sure it is divided across. But that
Of
brings
course.
me to another, thought that came across to my mind is, many times you have researchers, feminist researchers, who often struggle with, um, grassroots work that is there and theory, right? How did you navigate this? Were there any instances where, where it did not seem like this was the space where you felt needed the tweaks, the theory had to change?
Many, many times. As I told you, I think even the theories on social movements that I studied when I was at the Kennedy School, um, a lot of them were very academic. So, for example, they have a concept that, you know, um, social movements act when there is a political moment, a political opportunity for them to advance their agenda. But what I had
Right.
seen from the movements I worked with is that, in
Mm,
fact, social movements also create political moments. Do
mm.
you see the difference? They don't
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
sit around waiting one new act, a
exactly.
bill is
Yeah,
being discussed, let us go and influence. So, for instance,
yeah.
it's not like sex workers said, okay, let's wait when there's a trafficking bill, let's go and intervene. Okay. I
Yeah,
mean, they were
yeah.
also pushing for changes in the trafficking bill, and that is partly so. Just as all the women's movement's effort in India, for example, to
Mm,
create an act like POSH, prevention of
mm,
sexual
mm.
harassment in the workplace. That was
Yeah.
not because suddenly our government became so enlightened and said, oh, this women are being sexually harassed in the workplace. Let us have a legislation. No, that legislation came about because the movement pushed for it. So there's just one
Yes.
example. I think, the other thing is that I felt um, a lot of existing work that movements had done uh,
Mm,
on especially feminist movements
mm,
on bridging personal, community, and larger
mm,
political agendas and
mm,
bring converging these three.
mm,
So, for example, I saw how the indigenous women's movements all around the world, the movements of the women human rights defenders across Mexico and Central America, they brought together these three concepts of the environment, the body,
mm.
and security.
Yeah.
That the body is not safe, but our lands and habitats are also not safe.
Yes.
So they
Right.
were, they were framing these kind of really amazing new visions and concepts. And I felt that, a lot of that's not true now, but at that time in the, early 2000s, late 90s, I didn't feel that these visions, these powerful conceptualizations by movements were really being taken seriously in the academy.
Mm,
I'll give you a simple anecdote. One of the courses I used to co-teach at the Kennedy School was called Transnational Social Movements. Okay.
mm, mm,
And please understand, I'm not boasting here. This story is for a very different reason. When I used to teach a module, even the aisles, in the Kennedy School, they have this amphitheater type seating. Not only would all the seats be full, all the aisles would be full. And there'd be
mm,
students from the law school, a public health school, and here and there, everybody would crowd. Why? Because they heard that I bring the stories of grassroots movements,
mm,
that I
mm.
bring the insights and concepts and visions of grassroots movements into the discussion. So it's
Right.
not
Right.
just talking about, what Oxfam did and ActionAid did and blah, blah did on anti-poverty. Okay. But it's bringing
Mm, mm,
in what indigenous women's movements have done, or talking about how the Iranian women's movement has struggled for its voice and
right.
space and stayed alive for 40 years because there's no centralized leadership, so they don't know who to put in jail, that kind of thing.
Right.
So the point is that I'm trying to make is that even in the academy, there is a thirst among
Mm,
people for learning about these perspectives, which
yeah.
are largely excluded or hidden in the
Mm,
academic space.
true.
The final example I want to give you is, my colleagues, when I was in grassroots work, my colleagues had this joke that when we are doing grassroots work, Srilatha will keep on harassing us to analyze. She'll read some theory, she'll bring it. And then when I moved to the academic and research space, I did exactly the opposite. I would
Mm,
say, you have to look at grassroots experiences. You have to look at these realities. You have to look at the perspectives of people who are not in these theory building spaces. So we designed, for instance, when there was a big challenge in Bombay, this is just a very concrete example of how you can change the way even research is done. Yeah. So
yeah.
basically, there was a drive to, we worked with the pavement dwellers in Bombay, especially in South Bombay, and the women pavement dwellers, and there was a drive to demolish all of their houses and push them off the pavements. Yeah. And the sort of narrative that was being used to justify it is, they are all thieves and drifters and beggars, and they are just like, trash on the street. We need to clear the trash. So we decided to conduct a census and a kind of a survey to prove to the city that this was a wrong stereotype, that these were in fact people who were contributing to the city's economy and workforce. So to finish the story of the survey.
Mm,
So what we did was we sat down with the women's groups that we had already organized in South Bombay, the Pavement Women. And we said, here's what the city is saying about you, and this is why they want to demolish your settlements and throw you out of the city and send you back to where you came from on the theory that you just arrived in the last year or two. So, what do you want to tell the city? And we designed the entire survey questionnaire based on their decisions about what they felt were important to say. So, for example, one of the things they insisted on was, how many years ago did you migrate to Bombay? And the data came out that most of them had lived in these pavement settlements for at least 15 to 20 years. They hadn't arrived yesterday. What do you do? Their occupations, in terms of what they're contributing to the economy of the city, and so on. So, the census report was called We the Invisible, meaning we are invisible in these ways and only visible as trash cluttering, the roads. So that was a very, I think, powerful enactment of the concept that people have the capacity, and what we need to find is ways in which to bring their voices and their perspectives into these kinds of advocacy and social action processes. So that's why I wanted to share that example.
No, thank you so much for sharing. I think it also throws light on how, in many ways we seem very oblivious to what is right there in front of us. And it needs this kind of understanding, right, of um, what is the term right now, blind spots that we have, right,
Mm, mm.
that we continue to perpetuate in many ways, and then therefore the discrimination cycle continues. um, Having seen all of these movements, having created these really powerful theories, right, in the feminist activism space, um, how do you retain your own um, hope and resilience, given you know the pervasive nature of and the deep entrenched nature of patriarchy itself?
I think first and foremost, uh, I retain my hope because of what I have witnessed as possible. For example, you know, we were taught in social work school, and this is something that's sort of a widespread so-called wisdom, that social change is a very slow process. Yeah, it takes a lot of time. What I have witnessed is the absolute opposite. What I have witnessed is that if you use what we call the popular education methodology, that is, create a safe space, which is a very different space to what, say, women have had access to in the past, and you enable them to talk about not only the issues that are burning inside, this, you help to activate both this anger that they feel within, but also their innate sense of justice, of what is just and what is fair, which incidentally is always very inclusive. It's never sort of against, we just want to kill all the landlords. I never heard a landless woman in Bidar district or, Raichur district ever saying such a thing. We want just wages for our day's labor. That is what they would say. We want the same wages that the men are paid. This is what they would say. So I also saw how very rapidly a space like that enables women to focus on their priorities, the priority issues on which they want to act, and act, plan their actions and act together. And alongside that, they build their vision of change. It keeps growing, it keeps advancing, but it's actually very fast. I'll tell you a funny story of how I was asked to go and make a presentation to the Dutch Minister of International Aid. And this was when I was running the Mahila Samakya program, which was an Indo-Dutch bilateral project. So the Dutch were funding the Indian government to support this work. And I make this presentation of what at that time Mahila Samakya in Karnataka had been working only for 2 years. Okay. So I very enthusiastically presented, so many collectives have formed in these 300 villages. These actions have been started, blah, blah. And he sits there looking extremely skeptical and cynical. And he says to me at the end of my presentation, "That's all? That's all you've done in 2 years?" And without thinking and without being diplomatic, I just turned on him and I said, "Well, Mr. Pronk, patriarchy is at least 10,000 years old. I think we need more than 2 years to dismantle it."
Wow,
And
that was a great response.
he just shut up. I said, this is not digging bore wells or building roads.
Correct.
This is hitting at a power structure that is so resilient and so ancient. And you
Yeah.
want us to, I said, you should be proud of how much we've achieved in 2 years
Yeah.
against all odds.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my point is that I think this gives me great hope and inspiration of how much is possible if we don't go in and relate to women as beneficiaries, as victims, as, welfare cases. And, we're not just going in and giving things, but we're giving this space. We create this space and we enable them to, think about issues in a different way.
Yeah.
And as Yellamma, one of the women Sangha leaders in North Karnataka, as she put it, she said, "You see, sister, you have given us the one thing that no thief can come and rob from our house,
Mm.
a new way of thinking,
Thank you.
a new set of ideas. Who can take that away from me?" she said. I thought that was really a beautiful articulation. I think the second thing that keeps me very inspired and hopeful is that in Kriya, as you know, my main work has been in training. So over the last, say, from 2008 onwards till about 2018, I was training batches and batches and batches of young women activists. I
Yeah.
think totally in those 10 years, we trained almost 1,000 young activists across South Asia, across East and Southern Africa, and Middle East and North Africa. And I think working with these young women, many of whom continue to stay in touch with me, continue to email me about their work, etc., makes me feel very hopeful actually, because the
Mm.
kinds of things they are doing, the very new ways in which they're doing things,
Mm.
for example, how they are doing these incredible, uh, bridges between online movement building and on-ground movement building. It's very powerful. I've learned a lot from them. So that's what keeps me hopeful. I think finally, this is another question that I'm often asked, which is that I talk about feminist leadership as transforming power rather than just acquiring it. But what was my own experience with this? Which is another source of hope and inspiration, because I think what I did was help to model a whole new way of looking at leadership and practicing leadership. And the first time I did this very consciously was when I became director of Mahila Samakya in Karnataka. And what the first thing I did was create a leadership group with my district coordinators. So all decisions were taken collectively. They, in turn, were required to create a decision-making group at the district level with their field level activists who were called Sayoginis. And I think the most exciting and fascinating example of how I tried to uh, experiment with how we not only share power like this, which came easily to me because I think I should stop here for a moment and share one insight. As I started doing this, that is, delegating and distributing the power which formerly the director was supposed to hold, I discovered that I actually became more powerful in
Yeah.
a completely different way. So I discovered that the more you share power, the more powerful you become, but you have to have the capacity to recognize that other power that you're gaining. You know, the respect, the way people honor you because you've given it away and shared it with them. The amazing things they do as a result of it. All of that makes you more powerful too. But what we also did was a very radical experiment with accountability. Sadly, it was stopped after I left that role, where I said, okay, we keep talking about how we are accountable to women, the grassroots women, as who we are ultimately accountable to. But let's take a small, very practical, everyday organizational matter and see what it's telling us about the flow of power. Taking leave. Okay. So when you have to apply for leave, you have to apply to your supervisor, your boss. What
Correct.
if we reversed it? What if we said the field level activist has to take the leave permission? Who is going to be most affected by their absence? The women's sanghas, right? The women's collect. So they need to get the okay from the women's collectives for them to go on leave. When the district coordinator goes on leave, she has to get the okay from the field activists because they are the ones affected. When I have to go on leave, I have to get the permission of the district coordinator. So we instituted this, and initially there was a lot of resistance, a lot of anger, especially at the field level. They were like, we are working for their empowerment. Why should we ask their permission? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, gradually it took hold because that's where I used my power as director to stand strong. And I said, no, we'll experiment with this for 1 year. At the end of the year, if we don't feel it's working, we'll revisit. And sure enough, by the end of the year, they said, this is so fantastic. The women are so proud that they are being even asked. And, we feel so great. So you see, they also experienced how sharing power makes you feel more powerful. So,
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can see where the resilience and where the hope comes from these daily acts of showing up, sharing power, and gaining power from that sharing as well. Lastly, it has been, at least for, yeah, I'm sure you're reading the news. For the world of gender, there have been a lot of not that great news coming across globally, right? How do What's that one message you want to give to, say, young feminists, right, who are in many ways scared perhaps, or not very confident of sharing their views or their voice, or for that matter even standing up in for the world? They may be standing up for themselves, but right, so what is that one piece of advice that you would want to give them, given this kind of fractured kind of world that we're seeing globally, especially around gender?
yeah, actually, I think I'd have three messages. One would be Please remember that this is a sign of our success and our impact. Because backlash doesn't happen unless you have really dented the power structure in a very serious way. And it's frightened, it's worried it's crumbling. So hold that our last 100 years or 2000 years of resistance has not been in vain. We have had impact. Two, this too shall pass. Don't see this as the inevitable reality forever. This is backlash. This is a fighting back of the power structure. And there have been periods of time in the past when similar backlashes have taken place. For instance, against slave uprisings,
Yeah.
against anti caste uprisings. There have always been backlashes. But what we have to do is figure out how do we endure and how do we survive these periods going underground, going into maybe less visible spaces, working very locally, which is seen as less threatening. Most important during this period is we must keep alive our visions and our narratives. Don't let, the right wing fundamentalist narratives take over. Three is we are lucky we are living in an era where we have access to communication technologies and mobilization technologies that we didn't have 50 years ago. So, what we need to do is to actually explore and invent, each in our own spaces, guerrilla tactics for surviving, for ensuring that our movements, our perspectives, and our visions of what a socially just society is are kept alive, and exploit these spaces, but in a very clever way. And this is what I'm seeing hundreds of movements around the world doing, where there's severe oppression. And the one example I always give is if the Iranian women's movement could survive for 50 years with severe state oppression and repression, we can too.
Great. Thank you so much, Srilatha. I know that we could have had many more, issues and sub issues and topics that we could discuss, but that's all time that we have right now for this. Thank you so much for this conversation. And I
Most
learned a lot.
welcome.
Yes. And I'm just fortunate that we could, connect and we had this great conversation. So thank you so much. Thank you, Idem, and thank you, Devangana, for all the support that you gave for this conversation.